Hello, everyone. So today we are going to be learning about evolution and how there's evidence to support that evolution actually happened. So let's get right into it. I'm going to share my screen with you and we will begin. All right, so evolution is the idea that we all changed over a long period of time, or different organisms changed over a long period of time to become better suited to survive in their environment. So we're going to explain how fossils, biochemical, and anatomical evidence can support this theory that organisms evolved and changed again to better suit their environment. So our essential question is, what scientific evidence supports the process of evolution? The idea that we all may have began as primitive organisms, but over time grew to be able to survive and best adapt. So evolution is a gradual change in a species over time. We use evidence to support this evolution, like fossils, comparative anatomy, so comparing our body structures, biochemical evidence, so using DNA and proteins, and embryological evidence, which observes embryo development, how different types of babies form in the womb and how those forms look similar across multiple organisms. So what you are going to do for your guided notes is you are going to examine the evidence presented on each slide and use it to complete your evidence of evolution guided notes. So the first kind of evidence is fossil evidence. Here are some pictures of all the examples of fossils. What do you think a fossil is? Go ahead and write that on your notes now. Okay, so I hope you wrote down what you think a fossil is. So go ahead and write down what a fossil actually is. A fossil is the remains or evidence of organisms that lived in past ages. Scientists use relative dating to determine the approximate age of a fossil based on its position in the rock layers. So scientists actually look at where the fossil is located in the rock to tell how old or how young it is in comparison to other fossils. They found that the layer that has the oldest fossils is typically at the bottom, and the layer that has the youngest fossils are typically at the top. So the older fossils are found at the bottom, and the younger fossils are found at the top. The younger fossils are found at the top. So let's look at this image below. This is an example of a transitional fossil. What does the word transition mean? What two types of animals does this animal, called a titilic, look like? What do we think a titilic looks like? Here we have its picture on the right. So what does the word transition mean? Think about that. And so based on that definition of what transition means and the images above, what does a transitional fossil show us? Use the term evolution in your response. All right. So a transitional fossil may be a fossil that shows how a trend in evolution changes over time, or how an organism in evolution changes over time. A transitional fossil could be a fossil that kind of shows the halfway point between the change from one organism to the other. A trend is a change that you observe over time. So, what two trends do you see in the flow chart above? How did the organism change over time? So two trends that I see in the flow chart above are that we started out with an organism that was in the sea, and we ended with an organism that was on the land. That is the first trend that I see. The second trend that I see is that sea lilies are a type of plant underwater, whereas trees are plants on the land. So let's think about this. Which statement below best summarizes what biologists have learned about evolution by studying fossils? Is it A, that life on Earth has changed from simple organisms to more complex organisms? Is it B, life on Earth has remained the same? Is it C, life on Earth began with complex organisms and changed to more complex organisms? Or is it that life on Earth has changed rapidly? Record your answer in the space provided on your note packet. Yes, the answer is A. Life on Earth has changed from simple organisms to more complex organisms. The next evidence that scientists use to prove that evolution happened, that a gradual change over time between organisms happened, is anatomical evidence. Anatomical evidence is the comparing of structures, like limbs and tails and feet and bones. What do all of these organisms have in common? What do their similarities tell you about the organisms? Which two organisms do you think are most closely related, and why? Take this time now to write your answers in your notes. Okay. Scientists use homologous structures to help determine if organisms are closely related to one another. We have seen the prefix homo before. So what do you think homologous structures are? Homologous structures are body parts in different organisms that have the same structure, but different functions. Homo means same. So these are the same structure, but different functions. So some examples of homologous structures are things like forelimbs of humans, dogs, birds, and whales. All of these organisms have the same structure. All of the forelimbs contain similar bones. Just like we may have a radius and an ulna in a human, there is also a radius and an ulna in a dog, and a radius and an ulna in a bird, and even a radius and an ulna in a whale. But each of these structures contain different functions. These forelimbs have different activities. Humans use their forearms and hands for grabbing. Dogs use theirs for walking. Birds use theirs for flying. And whales use theirs for swimming. So let's look at the skeletons below. What is another example of some homologous structures? Explain your answer. What is something that they all have in common but use in different ways? Some of you may have said that they all have long snouts. All of them have long snouts or long facial features, but each of them use them in different ways. Deer may use theirs to get nuts and berries, whereas alligators may use theirs to catch their prey. Homologous structures show that organisms share a common answer. If multiple organisms have the same structure but different functions, that means they all had to come from a common ancestor, one organism that allowed all of them to have similar structures. This is called a phylogenetic tree, which we will talk about later on in this unit. You can find the common ancestor where two sections meet. So this may be considered the common ancestor for all of these organisms. Or this may be the common ancestor for a lizard and a bird. Wherever the sections meet is wherever they have a common ancestor. An organism that came before them that has a similar structure they were able to pass on to both organisms. Scientists also use analogous structures, which are the opposite of homologous structures. So what do you think analogous structures are? If homologous structures were structures that had the same structure and different function, what do you think analogous structures are? Analogous structures are body parts in different organisms that have the same function. They have the same function, but different structures. Let's look at some examples. Some examples of analogous structures are like bat wings, bird wings, and butterfly wings. All three kinds of wings have different structures. Bat wings are made up of skin stretched over bone. Bird wings are made up of bone, skin, and feathers. And butterfly wings are made up of thin layers of protein. Bats don't have feathers. And butterflies don't have bones. They're all made of different structures, but guess what? They all have the same function. Bats, birds, and butterflies use their wings to what? To fly. So let's look at these images below and let's explain why a clamshell, a turtle shell, and a crab shell are all examples of analogous structures. So, why do you think the clamshell, the turtle shell, and the crab shell are all examples of analogous structures? The clamshell and the turtle shell and the crab shell are all made of different materials. However, all three of them have the same function. They all function to protect the organism. Do you think that analogous structures show that organisms are closely related or distantly related? Explain your answer. Another piece of anatomical evidence for evolution. So another way that we can use comparing structures to support that organisms changed over time are called vestigial structures. Vestigial structures are structures or body parts with no current function in modern animals, meaning they don't have a function now, but maybe they used to. The remains of these structures show that maybe they functioned in our ancestors. This supports that there's evidence that organisms changed over time. Let's look at some examples. Whales have a pelvis bone, which is where hind legs would be attached, but whales don't have hind legs. So how would this be an example of a vestigial structure? What can you determine from whales having a pelvis bone that they don't use anymore? What could you hypothesize? Yes, whales evolved from an ancestor that had hind legs. Some humans have a muscle that allows them to wiggle their ears. However, ear wiggling does not help human survival. So how is this an example of a vestigial structure? This might suggest that moving ears probably helped our ancestors to better detect sounds in our environment, just like animals still use their moving ears. Have you ever dropped something loud on the floor and your dog or your cat's ears twitch or move to that sound? Maybe our ancestors had ears that could detect sounds in their environment so that they could better hunt and survive. Scientists also used embryology, which is the study of organisms' embryos, which is an early stage of development, to determine how organisms might be related. Embryology shows how organisms develop in similar ways. So here we have the early development of a fish, a salamander, a tortoise, a chick, a hog, a calf, a rabbit, and a human. These are all early developmental stages of an embryo, of a baby. And what do you notice about stage one? What do you notice about the earliest stage? What do you think they all have in common? They all have a tail. They all have an eye spot. And they all may have some form of gills. But humans don't have gills now. Rabbits don't have gills. Calves and hogs and chicks and tortoises don't have gills. But in their early development, they did, which suggests that we all evolved from a common ancestor. Though I may not look like a chicken today, my common ancestor is the same one of a chicken. Look at stage one. Again, which structures do all the embryos have at this stage? Which three structures do you see at stage one do all the embryos have in common? Go ahead and write those down. If you need to rewind the video, you can. But if not, keep on trucking. What do the similarities in structure suggest about their evolutionary history? Which two organisms do you think are most closely related? Explain your answer. Scientists also determine relationships between organisms by studying the molecules found in their bodies. Two common molecules that they study are DNA and proteins, specifically the amino acid sequence. So, what is this an illustration of? I'll give you some hints. These are bands. And typically the longest strands of DNA are at the top, and the shortest are at the bottom. What is this an illustration of? If you need to go back and review, go back to unit 5.4. Lesson 5.4. What process is used to make this? Again, unit 5, lesson 5.4. Which two deer species are most closely related? Explain your answer. Is it species 1 and species 2? Is it species 1 and species 3? Is it species 1 and species 4? Is it species 2 and species 3? Is it species 2 and species 4? Or is it species 3 and species 4? Which two deer species are most closely related? Remember, compare the number of bands. And the two species that have the most bands in common are most likely most closely related. So let's do it together. Species 1 and species 2 have 1, 2. They have 2 bands in common. Species 1 and species 3 have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Species 1 and species 3 have 5 bands in common. Species 1 and species 4 have 1, 2, 3, 3 bands in common. Species 2 and species 4 have, species 2 and species 3 have 1, 2, 2 bands in common. Species 2 and species 4 have 1, 2, 2 bands in common. And species 3 and species 4 have 1, 2, 3 bands in common. So which species had the most bands in common? It was species 1 and species 3 with 5 bands in common. Scientists also compare DNA sequences. Remember, DNA has 4 nitrogenous bases: adenine, A, guanine, G, thymine, T, and cytosine, C. The DNA alphabet is A, T, G, C. And so scientists compare the DNA sequences. So, which 2 species are most closely related? So let's see who has the least amount of differences. So species 1 and species 2, this is different. Your C and G are different. Your G and T are different. Your G and T are different. Your T and G are different. So they have 4 differences. When we're comparing DNA sequences, remember, we have to find which 2 species have the least amount of differences. So species 1 and species 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Species 1 and species 3 have 6 differences. G, G, C, G, T, G, T, G, A, T, A. Species 1 and species 4 have 5 differences. Let's try species 2 and species 3. Species 2 and species 3 have 3 differences. Let's try species 2 and species 4. Species 2 and species 4 have 2 differences. Let's try species 3 and species 4. Species 3 and species 4 only have one difference. So, which two species are the most closely related? Which two species have the least amount of differences between their DNA sequences? Explain your answer. Scientists also compare proteins. They compare amino acid sequences of different parts of proteins between species to see who may have the most recent common ancestors. So, out of the human, the horse, the gorilla, the chimpanzee, and the zebra, which two species have the most recent common ancestor? And explain your answer. As we see, the human has lysine, glutamine, histine, and isoleucine as their amino acid sequence. Chimpanzees also have lysine, glutamine, histine, and isoleucine as a part of their amino acid sequence. So humans and chimpanzees must be or must share the most recent common ancestor. Explain how you know. So place the terms in the word bank into the correct evidence categories below. Then explain what each one tells us about evolution. You are to separate each of your words in the word bank into fossil evidence, anatomical evidence, and biochemical evidence. For example, would embryology be an example of fossil evidence, anatomical evidence, or biochemical evidence? Right, it would be an example of anatomical evidence. Would relative dating be an example of fossil evidence, anatomical evidence, or biochemical evidence? Exactly. Relative dating would be an example of fossil evidence. All right, thank you so much for watching our quick video talking about evidence of evolution. How can we prove or how can we support that evolution happened gradually over time? What evidence can we use to support that over time we evolved or changed to better survive? See you guys tomorrow.